What would you do if the only thing you could afford was a curse? If the world had stripped you down to a single dollar, a tired horse, and the ghost of a memory, and then offered you a piece of land so worthless, so famously barren, that its deed was a joke written on a napkin? This is the story of Elias Thorne, a man who lost everything, and the $5 ranch that everyone in Redemption Bluff knew was good for nothing but burying secrets. But the truth waiting under that hard-baked soil was not a secret, but a promise. And what happened next would rewrite the definition of wealth for the entire valley. So settle in, find a comfortable chair, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, as we journey back to a time when a man's worth was measured not by what he owned, but by what he refused to abandon. The dust of Redemption Bluff tasted like defeat. It coated Elias Thorne's tongue, settled in the creases of his worn coat, and clouded the air with a gritty, sun-bleached haze. He rode into town on a mare the color of that same dust, an animal so bone-weary and old that her every step was a quiet protest. The horse, Mercy, was all he had left of the life that had been taken from him. The ranch his father had built, the fields his grandfather had cleared, the small white house where his mother had been born. All of it gone, swallowed by the cold arithmetic of a bank ledger and the voracious ambition of a man named Bartholomew Kane. Elias carried the foreclosure notice folded in his breast pocket, a brittle paper monument to his failure. He didn't ride into Redemption Bluff, looking for a new start. He came looking for an end, a place quiet enough to let the silence consume the noise in his head. The town itself was little more than a single street gasping for breath between two unforgiving mesas, a saloon, a general store, a livery, and a church with a steeple that listed like a tired old man. As he dismounted in front of the livery, the stableman, Jedediah, a man with a face like a worn saddle, squinted at him. Recognition dawned slowly in his pale eyes. Elias? Elias Thorne? Good Lord, son. I heard what happened. Elias just nodded, his throat too tight for words. He handed the reins to Jedediah. She needs water, and a brushing if you have the time. Of course, son. Of course. Jedediah ran a gentle hand down Mercy's flank. She's looking thin. You both are. He didn't have the money for a proper boarding, but Jedediah seemed to understand. He led the mare into the cool darkness of the stable without another word about payment. Elias watched them go. The familiar scent of hay and horsehide, a painful echo of a life he could no longer claim. He had a few dollars to his name, enough for a week's worth of hardtack and beans, maybe a bottle of cheap whiskey to dull the edges of his grief. He pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon, the sudden dimness and roar of voices a physical blow. And there, holding court at the center of the room, was the architect of his ruin. Bartholomew Kane. A big man in a tailored suit, his face florid and his laugh a booming declaration of his own importance. He was the one who had bought the Thorne Ranch at auction for a fraction of its worth. He saw Elias enter, and a cruel, knowing smile spread across his lips. He raised his glass. Well, well, look what the wind blew in. The last of the Thornes. Come for a drink on your old land's profits, Elias? The room fell quiet. Every eye turned to him. Elias felt the familiar shame rise, hot and suffocating. He said nothing, just walked to the bar and laid a coin down. Whiskey, he said to the bartender, his voice a low rasp. Kane wouldn't let it be. He strode over, clapping a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder. No need for that, my boy. Your money's no good here. Not when you're a man of such limited means. He laughed, and a few others joined in, nervous and eager to please. Tell you what, Cain boomed, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. I feel for you. A man needs land. A man needs a home. I happen to own a plot I'm willing to part with. A real gem. He was playing to the crowd now, his eyes glittering with malice. The old Blackwood scratch. You know the one, boys. Barren as a banker's heart and twice as cursed. The men chuckled. The Blackwood scratch was a local legend, a patch of rock and thorns where nothing grew, where 3 separate families had tried and failed to make a go of it, each one leaving poorer and more broken than they'd arrived. It was said the ground itself was soured by some old tragedy. I'll sell it to you, Thorn, a fresh start. Cain pulled a napkin from the bar and a pen from his pocket. He scribbled a few lines. The deed to the Blackwood scratch, in exchange for, let's say, $5. He slid the napkin and the pen across the bar. It was the ultimate humiliation. An offer of land so worthless it could be traded for a pittance on a piece of trash. Elias looked at the napkin. He looked at Cain's triumphant, sneering face. He looked at the circle of watching men. He had nothing. Less than nothing. He had only his name, and Cain was trying to grind even that into the dust. Slowly, deliberately, Elias reached into his pocket, pulled out his last 5 silver dollars, and placed them on the bar. He picked up the pen and signed his name. Elias Thorn. The saloon erupted in laughter. Cain roared, slapping the bar. He took it! The boy bought the curse. Elias folded the napkin, placed it in his pocket next to the foreclosure notice, picked up his untouched whiskey, and downed it in one smooth motion. He set the glass down with a quiet click, turned, and walked out of the saloon, the sound of their mockery following him like a physical shadow. What would you do with a deed written on a napkin? A title to a piece of land that existed only as a punchline? Would you tear it up and let the pieces scatter on the wind, a final admission of defeat? Or would you hold on to it, the last tangible thing in a world that had taken everything else? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're enjoying this story of resilience, be sure to give us a like and subscribe for more tales from the forgotten corners of the frontier. When Elias stepped back into the blinding sunlight, he had no illusions. He knew he hadn't just bought a piece of land, he had bought their scorn outright. The laughter from the saloon was a brand on his back, but Elias walked on, his stride even, his face a mask of stone. He returned to the livery, where Jedediah was gently brushing Mercy's coat, the rhythmic strokes a small, quiet act of kindness in a world that had become brutally loud. The old liveryman looked up, his eyes full of a question he didn't dare ask. I heard the commotion, he said, his voice low. Cain's a hard man. He is that, Elias replied, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. He reached out and stroked Mercy's nose. The mare leaned into his touch, her warm breath a comfort. She was the only living thing that knew the man he had been before the bank notices and the auctioneer's gavel. She remembered the green pastures of home. Where will you go? Jedediah asked. Elias pulled the napkin from his pocket and unfolded it. Looks like I'm a landowner again. Jedediah squinted at the scribbled words, and a deep sigh escaped him. The Blackwood scratch. Son, there's nothing out there. It's poison ground. Old man Blackwood lost his wife and son to fever on that plot, and folks say his grief soured the soil for good. Nothing's grown there since. It's a place for endings, not beginnings. Then it's fitting, Elias said, a bleak finality in his tone. He gathered Mercy's reins, his movements stiff. Jedediah stopped him with a hand on his arm. The old man disappeared into his office and returned with a small, heavy sack. "Oats," he said, pressing it into Elias's hand. "For the horse. No charge." Elias looked from the sack to the old man's weathered face. It was the first gesture of genuine charity he'd received in months. "I can't," he started. "You can," Jedediah interrupted gruffly. "Your father was a good man. He'd have done the same for my boy." The mention of his father was a fresh wound, but Elias simply nodded his thanks, his throat too thick to speak. He led Mercy out of the livery and started down the main street, heading toward the edge of town. The whispers followed him. He could feel the eyes of the townspeople from behind their curtains and in the doorways of their shops. The fool who bought the curse. The broken man taking his final walk. As he neared the last house, a small, neat cabin with a porch full of drying herbs, he saw her. An old woman sat in a rocking chair, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles. Her hair was silver white, braided into a single, thick rope. He'd heard of her, Sarah Blackwood, Isaiah's granddaughter, the last of her line. The townspeople treated her with a mixture of fear and respect, saying she had the sight, that she could read the land like a book. She stopped rocking as he approached. Her eyes, dark and startlingly clear, didn't look at him, but at the old mare beside him. Mercy, who had been plodding with her head low, suddenly lifted it, her ears pricked forward. She let out a soft nicker, a sound Elias hadn't heard from her in weeks. The old woman gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if in reply to the horse. Then her gaze shifted to Elias. Her voice, when she spoke, was like the rustle of dry leaves, ancient and certain. Some creatures remember where the earth keeps its promises. Elias stared at her, the words hanging in the air, strange and heavy. He didn't know what they meant, or what he was supposed to say in return. Before he could form a reply, the sound of hoofbeats approached from behind. It was Cain, astride a magnificent black stallion that was the very picture of power and wealth. He pulled the horse to a halt beside Elias, looking down at him from his superior height. "Off to claim your kingdom, Thorn?" he sneered. "Don't forget to pack a shovel. You'll need it to dig your own grave. When that first snow flies, you'll come crawling back here, begging for a spot on my stable floor." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet street. He spurred his horse, showering Elias and Mercy in a cloud of dust, and galloped away. Elias stood there for a long moment, the dust settling on his shoulders, the old woman's cryptic words and Cain's cruel laughter warring in his mind. He looked down the long, empty road that led to the Blackwood scratch. It was just him, his tired old horse, and a curse written on a napkin. He took a deep breath of the dusty air and began to walk. The journey to the Blackwood scratch was a pilgrimage into desolation. The dusty track that passed for a road dwindled to a pair of ruts, then to a faint trail choked with sagebrush and sharp-edged rocks. The land grew leaner and harder with every mile. The sparse grass gave way to cracked earth, the cottonwoods to skeletal junipers that clung to the hillsides like desperate old men. Elias walked, leading Mercy to spare her the extra burden. The sun was relentless, a white-hot coin in a bleached blue sky. The silence was immense, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the gravel, the tired sigh of Mercy's breathing, and the low, constant moan of the wind. This was a land that had no love for men. It endured them, and when they were gone, it scoured their memory from the soil. By late afternoon, they crested a low ridge and he saw it below. It was worse than the stories. The Blackwood scratch was a shallow bowl of pale, alkaline dirt, studded with gray rock and thorny, withered bushes. It looked like a scar on the face of the earth. At its center, a single jagged finger of black stone rose from the ground, the remains of a chimney, the only evidence that anyone had ever dared to call this place home. A wave of profound hopelessness washed over Elias. Cain had been right. This wasn't a place to live. It was a place to be forgotten. He had paid $5 for a tombstone. Mercy seemed to feel it too. She stopped, her head hanging, her sides heaving. He led her down into the basin, the air growing still and hot. The ground was hard as iron under his boots. He walked over to the ruined chimney. The stones were cold to the touch, though they'd been sitting in the sun all day. They were expertly laid, the work of a man who had intended to stay. A man who had built a hearth for a family that would never gather around it. He ran his hand over the rough, soot-stained interior. He could almost feel the ghost of a fire, the phantom warmth of a home that had died here. He unsaddled Mercy, letting her wander to a patch of stubborn, dry-looking weeds that she nibbled at without enthusiasm. Elias set up his meager camp in the lee of the chimney, the only shelter from the incessant wind. He built a small fire from the dead branches of a skeletal mesquite, the flames struggling to take hold. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, the true character of the place revealed itself. It wasn't just empty, it was watchful. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, filled with an ancient, sorrowful waiting. He ate his meal of dry biscuits and jerky, sharing a piece with Mercy. He sat with his back against the chimney stones, watching the stars ignite in the vast, ink-black sky. There were more stars here than he had ever seen, so bright and close they felt like a ceiling of scattered diamonds. But their beauty offered no comfort. It only served to magnify his own insignificance. He remembered his father, on nights like this, standing on their porch and naming the constellations. That's the hunter, son. That's the plow. His father had known the sky, had known the earth. He had taught Elias how to read the clouds for rain, how to listen to the soil to know when to plant. He had believed that if you respected the land, it would provide. Elias looked around at the barren, hostile ground of the Blackwood Scratch. His father's faith seemed like a child's story now. The land didn't care. It gave and it took, and there was no reason to it. He rolled himself in his single blanket, the hard ground unforgiving beneath him. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The wind whispered through the cracks in the chimney stones, and it sounded like a name, a long, drawn-out sigh of loss. He lay there, awake in the starlight, feeling the profound, crushing weight of being utterly and completely alone. Days bled into a week. Elias fell into a rhythm born of necessity and stubbornness. Each morning, he woke before dawn, the air sharp and cold, and shared his meager breakfast with Mercy. Then, the work began. It was a fool's errand, and he knew it. He was trying to clear a patch of ground large enough for a small garden, should he survive to see the spring. He used his hands and a flat piece of rock to pry stones from the earth. The soil was a fine, pale powder that offered no purchase, no promise of life. His hands, already calloused from a lifetime of farm work, grew raw and then tougher still. The sun beat down on his back, and the wind never ceased its low, mournful song. He was a solitary figure in a vast, indifferent landscape, a man locked in a silent argument with the dirt. The labor was punishing, but it was also a shield. As long as he was moving, as long as his muscles ached, he could keep the memories at bay. He didn't have to think about the green of his family's pastures or the smell of his mother's kitchen. He only had to think about the next rock. But something strange was happening with Mercy. The old mare, who usually stayed close to their small camp, began to wander. And she always wandered to the same spot. At the base of a low, weathered cliff face that formed the northern boundary of the property, not 20 yards from the ruined chimney, was a small alcove, sheltered from the wind. Every afternoon, as the sun began its descent, Mercy would make her way over to this spot. She would stand there for an hour or more, her head lowered, occasionally nudging a particular flat, moss-covered stone with her nose. At first, Elias paid it no mind. She was old. It was just a peculiar habit, a quirk of her age. He would call her back to camp for her share of the oats, and she would come. But the next day she would be back at the same stone, patient and persistent. It became a part of their daily routine, his back-breaking work, the setting sun, and Mercy's quiet vigil by the rock. One evening, he was too tired to call her. He simply sat, his body aching, and watched her. The sun was low, casting long, dramatic shadows across the basin. The light hit the cliff face at a sharp angle, a wash of liquid gold. And in that fleeting, perfect light, Elias saw it. Something on the rock face just above the stone Mercy kept nudging. He squinted, thinking it was a trick of the light, a pattern in the lichen. He stood up, his joints protesting, and walked over. Mercy looked up at him, her dark eyes calm and intelligent, and gave a soft snort as if to say, "It took you long enough." He ran his raw fingertips over the rock. It was no trick. Beneath the thin layer of lichen and dust, a symbol had been carved into the stone. It was a simple shape, a spiral with a straight line running through its center. It wasn't a brand he recognized, nor any kind of prospector's mark he'd ever seen. It felt older, more deliberate. It was a key he didn't have the lock for, a question asked in a language he didn't speak. He looked from the symbol on the rock to the patient old horse beside him, and then at the ground she had been indicating for days. For the first time since he'd arrived, a feeling other than despair began to stir in his chest. It was a flicker of curiosity, faint but persistent, like a single candle lit in a vast, dark room. The land had spoken its first word. The discovery of the symbol shifted something fundamental in Elias. His labor was no longer a mindless penance. It became an investigation. The next morning, he abandoned his futile attempt at clearing a garden plot and focused his energy on the alcove. The area was choked with thorny brush and a tumble of smaller rocks that had fallen from the cliff face over the years. He began to clear it, not with the frantic energy of a treasure hunter, but with the slow, methodical patience of a man deciphering a sacred text. Mercy stood nearby, a silent, dusty sentinel, her presence a quiet encouragement. She would watch him work for a time, then wander off to graze, always returning as if to check on his progress. As he pulled away the gnarled roots and lifted the heavy stones, his hands began to learn the story of this small piece of ground. He could feel where the water ran after a hard rain, where the soil was deeper, where the rock beneath was solid. This was a language his father had taught him, the language of the land, spoken not in words, but in texture, weight, and resistance. His hands, torn and bleeding at first, began to heal into a tougher, more resilient leather. The sun darkened his skin, and the hard work stripped away the last of the soft living he had ever known, leaving behind a lean, sinewy strength. He was becoming a part of the landscape, weathered and shaped by the same wind and sun that had carved the mesas. And as he worked, he found more. hidden beneath a tangle of mesquite roots. Another symbol was carved into a buried stone, this one a series of wavy lines like water. A few feet away, at the base of the chimney's foundation, he uncovered a third, a circle with a single dot in its center, like an eye. They were a trail of breadcrumbs left by a ghost. They seemed to be leading him from the cliff face directly toward the ruined hearth. The work was slow and exhausting. There were days when doubt crept in, a cold shadow telling him he was a fool chasing patterns in the dirt, a madman taking directions from an old horse. He would look at the vast, empty sky and the barren ground, and the weight of his folly would press down on him. On those days, Mercy would seem to sense his despair. She would walk over and rest her heavy head on his shoulder, her quiet solidity a balm to his frayed spirit. Her presence was a constant, a living link to his past, and a silent testament to a faith he was only just beginning to understand. He began talking to her as he worked, his voice rusty from disuse. He told her about the farm, about his father, about the shame of losing it all. He spoke of Cain's mockery and the town's pity. The old mare would listen, her ears twitching, her dark eyes soft. She was his confessor, his companion, the keeper of his history. The act of speaking the words aloud seemed to lessen their power over him. They became just a story, not a verdict. One afternoon, as he cleared the last of the debris from around the chimney's foundation, his shovel struck something that wasn't rock. It made a dull, resonant sound. He knelt and brushed away the fine, pale dirt. It was a large, flat slab of slate, dark gray and smooth, completely different from the rough, tan granite of the other foundation stones. It was perfectly rectangular and had been set with deliberate care. And carved into its center was the final symbol, the spiral with the line through it, the same one from the cliff face. It was the destination. All the other marks had been pointing here. He ran his hand over the carving, a jolt of electricity passing through him. The wind died down. The air grew still. For a moment, the entire world seemed to be holding its breath. The cryptic words of the old woman, Sarah Blackwood, echoed in his mind. Some creatures remember where the earth keeps its promises. He looked at Mercy, who stood watching him, her gaze unwavering. She had remembered. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and crimson as Elias stared at the slate slab. This was it, the end of the trail. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he was on the threshold of an answer. He didn't know the question yet, but the answer was waiting for him under this stone. He needed a lever. He searched the area around the chimney, his eyes scanning the debris of the past. He found it half buried near the collapsed wall, a long, heavy piece of iron, likely a support beam from the original hearth, rusted but solid. It felt heavy and purposeful in his hands. He wedged one end into the thin crack between the slate and the surrounding granite stones. He took a deep breath and put his full weight on it. The stone didn't move. It was sealed tight by time and settled earth. He tried again, grunting with the effort, his muscles straining. The iron bar bent slightly, but the stone held fast. Sweat beaded on his forehead and ran into his eyes, stinging. He was tired, hungry, and for a moment, he felt the familiar sting of failure. Maybe this was the final joke, a locked door with no key. But then he looked at Mercy. She hadn't moved. She stood there, patient as the mountains, her presence a silent command to continue. He took another breath, repositioned the bar, and tried one last time, summoning every ounce of strength he possessed. He wasn't just lifting a rock. He was pushing back against Cain, against the bank, against the whispers and the pity. He was pushing back against the ghost of his own surrender. There was a low groan, a grating sound of stone on stone, and then a sharp crack. The slab shifted just an inch, but it was enough. Hope surged through him. He worked the bar back and forth, widening the gap, until finally, with a great sucking sound of released pressure, he was able to slide the heavy slate slab aside. A wave of cool, musty air rose from the dark cavity beneath. It smelled of deep earth, of leather, and of time itself. He peered into the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs. He fetched his lantern from the camp, and with a trembling hand, he lit the wick. He lowered the flickering light into the hole. The beam fell upon two objects, nestled on a bed of dry sand. The first was a large satchel made of thick, oiled leather, dark with age and bound with sturdy straps. The second was a small, rectangular tin box, the kind used for holding documents or tea. His hand shook as he reached in and lifted out the tin box. It was surprisingly light. He sat back on his heels and worked the lid open. Inside, resting on a piece of faded velvet, was a small, leather-bound journal. He opened it carefully, the pages brittle. The handwriting was neat, elegant cursive. "My name is Isaiah Blackwood," the first entry began, "and this land is my witness." He read on, the lantern light dancing on the page as Isaiah's story unfolded. He had not been a farmer, but a prospector. He had found a small but incredibly rich vein of gold in the hills, but he was a man haunted by the greed he saw in the world. He feared it would bring bandits, ruin, and death. So he hid his discovery, telling no one, not even his family. The journal chronicled how, during a terrible drought that struck the valley, he used his secret wealth to help his neighbors, leaving anonymous gifts of food, seed, and gold dust to families on the brink of ruin. He was building a home, but his real treasure, he wrote, was the community he was silently nurturing. The last entry was dated the day before the fever took his wife. He wrote of his plan to finally tell her his secret, to use the rest of the gold to build a school. He never got the chance. The journal ended there. Elias closed the book, his throat tight with emotion. This wasn't a curse. It was a legacy of quiet charity. He then turned to the leather satchel. He undid the straps, his fingers fumbling. He opened the flap and tilted it toward the light. What spilled out onto the ground was not a pile of coins, but a cascade of heavy, raw gold nuggets, their surfaces dull in some places, brilliantly gleaming in others. They shone in the lantern light with a soft, warm fire, a treasure not of greed, but of hope. And in that moment, Elias Thorne understood. He was not the owner of this place. He was its new keeper. Elias sat there for a long time, the gold nuggets scattered around him like fallen stars, the journal heavy in his lap. The weight of Isaiah Blackwood's story settled over him, a responsibility far heavier than the gold itself. This wasn't a windfall to be squandered. It was a trust to be honored. As the moon climbed high, a change came over the sky. The stars were swallowed by a thick, bruised-looking bank of clouds rolling in from the north. The wind, which had been a constant companion, now picked up a new, sharper edge. It carried the scent of snow. A blizzard, Elias realized with a jolt of alarm. An early, vicious storm, catching the season unprepared. He quickly gathered the gold, returning it to the satchel and placing it back in the hidden cavity along with the journal. He slid the heavy slate stone back into place, covering the secret once more. He had to secure his camp. He reinforced his small shelter against the chimney, using the heavy oilcloth he'd found in the cache to create a better windbreak. He gave Mercy the last of the oats from Jedediah's sack and huddled her into the most protected corner of the alcove. The first flakes of snow began to fall, not gently, but in a driving, horizontal blast. The temperature plummeted. The world beyond his small circle of firelight dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. He huddled by the fire, feeding it sparingly from his small woodpile, wrapped in his single thin blanket. The cold was a physical thing, a predator that gnawed at his bones. The wind shrieked through the stones of the chimney, a chorus of ghostly voices. This was the test. The land was asking if he was worthy of its secret. He thought of Isaiah Blackwood, of his quiet strength, and found a reservoir of his own he didn't know he possessed. Sometime deep in the night, through the howling of the storm, he heard another sound, a faint, desperate cry. He thought he was imagining it, a trick of the wind. But then he saw it, a tiny, flickering point of light, a lantern swinging wildly in the blizzard, far out in the basin. Someone was out there, lost. Without a second thought, Elias grabbed his lantern and plunged into the storm. The wind tore at him, and the snow blinded him, but he kept his eyes fixed on that frantic light. He found them a quarter-mile away, a family, a man, a woman, and 2 small children, huddled beside a wagon with a broken axle. They were the Millers, new homesteaders trying to reach the next valley before winter. They were half frozen, their faces pale with fear and cold. "Come with me," Elias shouted over the wind. "There's shelter." He helped the man, whose name was Thomas, get his wife and children to their feet. The little girl was so cold she couldn't walk. Elias lifted her into his arms, her small body frighteningly light. He wrapped her in his own blanket, shielding her from the wind's fury. He led them back through the blinding snow, a human chain of desperation, guided only by the memory of where his camp lay. They stumbled back to the chimney, the small fire a beacon of hope in the maelstrom. He settled the family into the shelter he had built, pushing them close to the stones that still held the residual warmth of 100 long-dead fires. He piled the last of his wood onto the flames, creating a blaze that pushed back the gnawing cold. He gave them the last of his jerky and biscuits. The mother, Sarah Miller, wept with gratitude as she held her children close to the life-giving heat. All through the long, brutal night, Elias stood watch. He was no longer just Elias Thorne, the failed farmer. He was the steward of the Blackwood scratch, the keeper of the hearth. He was sheltering a family by the same chimney where Isaiah Blackwood had dreamed of his own. He didn't offer them gold. He offered them what Isaiah had truly valued: warmth, shelter, and a share of what little he had. He was honoring the trust, and in doing so he felt a sense of purpose so profound it burned brighter than any fire. The blizzard raged for 2 days. When the storm finally broke, it revealed a world transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine white snow. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the air was so cold and clean it hurt to breathe. The Miller family was safe. The color had returned to their cheeks, and the light of hope had returned to their eyes. Elias shared the last of his coffee with Thomas Miller as they surveyed the broken wagon. "We'd have died out there," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how we can ever repay you." "No payment needed," Elias said simply. "Just glad I was here." Together the 2 men fashioned a temporary splint for the axle, using wood from the wagon and strips of leather. It was a slow, cold job, but by midday the wagon was passable. As the millers prepared to leave, Sarah pressed a small, carved wooden bird into Elias's hand. "It's not much," she said, her eyes shining. "My boy carved it, but we wanted you to have something." Elias closed his hand around the small token. It felt more valuable than all the gold buried beneath his feet. He watched them go, their wagon creaking slowly across the snow-covered basin until they were just a small speck on the horizon. The silence that returned was different now. It was not the silence of loneliness, but of peace. A few days later, once the snows had melted enough to make the trail passable, Elias rode Mercy into Redemption Bluff. He carried one small, modest gold nugget wrapped in a piece of cloth in his pocket. He didn't go to the saloon. He went to the small office of Mr. Abernathy, the town's assayer, a quiet, scholarly man with spectacles perched on his nose. Elias unwrapped the nugget and placed it on the counter. "I'd like to know what this is worth," he said. Mr. Abernathy picked it up, his professional indifference dissolving as he felt its surprising weight. He placed it on his scale, peered at it through his loupe, and performed a small scratch test with a drop of acid. His eyebrows rose higher and higher until they nearly disappeared into his hairline. He looked up at Elias, his expression one of pure astonishment. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "this is some of the purest placer gold I have ever seen. Where on earth did you find it?" Elias simply met his gaze. "On my property." The assayer, a man known for his discretion, just nodded slowly, a deep and newfound respect dawning in his eyes. He named a figure that made Elias's breath catch in his chest. News, however, does not require a loud voice to travel in a small town. It moves like the wind. By the time Elias stepped out of the assayer's office, the story of the millers had already made its way through town. He was the man who had sheltered a family in the blizzard, the quiet hero of the Blackwood Scratch. Now, a new whisper joined the first. Elias Thorne had struck gold on the cursed land. He walked to the livery to check on Mercy. Jedediah met him at the door, his face alight. "I heard," he said, clapping Elias on the shoulder. "I always knew your father's son had grit." Across the street, Bartholomew Kane stood on the saloon porch, a drink frozen halfway to his lips. He had heard the news. He watched as townsfolk, the same ones who had laughed at Elias, now nodded to him with deference. A few even tipped their hats. Kane's face was a thunderous mask of disbelief and fury. He had practically given away a fortune out of spite. Elias saw him watching. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply held Kane's gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement of the turn of fortune's wheel. In that quiet look, Kane was utterly and completely diminished. He had been beaten not by a rival, but by the very thing he'd dismissed as worthless. Elias Thorne had not found a treasure. He had become one. The town of Redemption Bluff no longer saw a failure. They saw a founder. Months passed, and the seasons turned. The harsh white of winter gave way to the tender green of spring, and then the deep, golden tones of late summer. The Blackwood Scratch was no longer a scar on the land. A small, sturdy cabin now stood where the ruined chimney had been, built by Elias's own hands from pine brought down from the high country. The chimney itself was the heart of the new home, built from the original stones, a testament to the past that now warmed the future. A neat fence of split rails enclosed a thriving garden, its soil enriched and tended with a farmer's loving care. A handful of healthy cattle grazed peacefully in a newly cleared pasture. Elias had used the gold not for luxury, but for life. He had bought tools, seeds, and livestock. He had paid Jedediah fairly for his kindness and established a line of credit at the general store built on his word alone. He had sent a quiet donation to the Millers, delivered by a traveling preacher, ensuring their new homestead would survive its first year. He didn't live like a rich man. He lived like a homesteader, his days governed by the sun and the needs of his land. He had honored Isaiah Blackwood's legacy not by hoarding the gold, but by transforming it into a self-sustaining home, a place of quiet abundance. People from Redemption Bluff would sometimes ride out to see the transformation for themselves. They would find Elias mending a fence or watering his crops, and they would look on in a kind of reverent silence at the miracle he had wrought from cursed ground. The whispers had changed from mockery to awe. Bartholomew Kane had left town, selling his vast holdings after his public humiliation, unable to bear living in the shadow of the man he had tried to destroy. The evening light, thick and golden, poured into the valley. Elias stood on the porch of his new home, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. Mercy, now retired to a life of leisure, grazed nearby, her coat shining with health. He looked out at the land, at the fields he had cleared, at the home he had built. He had come here seeking an ending, and instead, he had found the truest kind of beginning. He ran a hand over the smooth, planed wood of the porch railing, feeling the solid reality of it beneath his calloused palm. This was his. Not the gold buried beneath it, but the life that had grown on top of it. He thought of all he had lost and all he had found, and a quiet understanding settled in his soul. He looked out at the horizon and spoke the words softly, to himself and to the listening land. "Some ground doesn't hold a curse," he murmured. "It holds a trust." Thank you for joining us for this story to the very end. It's a powerful reminder about finding value where others see none, and how true wealth is measured in the life you build, not the treasure you find. If this tale of patience and quiet vindication resonated with you, please consider leaving a like and a comment below. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story from the heart of the frontier. Until then, take care.